A first-class ticket should have been the start of Jayden Brooks's dream trip, his first flight alone. A gift meant to celebrate his hard work. But before he could even reach his seat, the captain stopped him, questioned him, and ordered him. Off the plane, in front of everyone, humiliated and confused, Jayden sat in the terminal. Until a stranger in a tailored jacket walked up, called him by name, and said 6 words that would change everything. You're supposed to be in 1A. Who was this man? Why did his arrival shift the entire balance of power? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sliding glass doors opened with a soft whoosh, letting in a rush of cool, recycled air that smelled faintly of coffee, floor polish, and the faint temps of jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac. Jayden Brooks stepped inside, his backpack snug. Against his shoulders, one hand curled around the handle of a small carry-on suitcase, the other gripping a crisp white envelope. Inside was his boarding pass, first class, printed in bold letters that still felt unreal every time his eyes landed on them. He had looked at it so many times on the ride to the airport that the edges were already beginning to bend. The terminal buzzed with the usual early afternoon rhythm, rolling luggage wheels clicking over tile, distant announcements about boarding zones, and the chatter of travelers juggling coffee cups and phones. Jayden's sneakers squeaked faintly as he walked, his steps measured, deliberate. He had dressed the way his mother always told him to when meeting someone important: dark jeans without rips, a pressed button-up shirt in navy blue, clean white. Shoes. Nothing flashy, but neat. Respectable. He wanted to blend in, even though a part of him knew he wouldn't, as he moved past the check-in counters. He caught snippets of conversation, complaints about delays, hurried confirmations of gate numbers, a child somewhere whining for a snack. It was just another day at the airport for everyone else. But for Jayden, every sound, every movement felt magnified. This was his first time flying alone. His palms were damp despite the cold air, and the faint hum of nerves sat just under his ribs, a constant flutter. At security, he placed his backpack and carry-on into the gray plastic bins, slipping off his sneakers when told. The TSA officer glanced at his dye estate-issued card with his 17-year-old face staring back, and then at his boarding pass. For a split second, something flickered in the man's eyes. He scanned the pass, handed it back without a word, and motioned him through the body scanner. Jayden told himself he was imagining it. Once he cleared security, he followed the overhead signs toward Concourse B. His gate was at the far end, just past a row of high-end coffee kiosks and souvenir shops selling overpriced hoodies with the city's skyline on them. He kept his eyes on the large monitor above the food court until he found his flight number and departure time, still on schedule. When he reached the gate, there were already a few passengers waiting in clusters near the boarding lanes. Of them were dressed in business attire: navy blazers, pressed trousers, polished shoes that clicked against the tile. Few glanced up as he approached, their gazes lingering just long enough for him to feel it. Not hostile, not even openly questioning, just curious. The kind of look that asked silently if he was lost. Jayden took a seat 2 rows back from the boarding lane, pulling out his phone to check the time. He had more than 30 minutes before boarding, but his leg bounced restlessly. Told himself to focus on the good and the fact that he was going somewhere new, on the fact that this trip was a gift, something rare, something he might never get again. He scrolled aimlessly through his messages, pausing on the last one from his mother before she dropped him off. Call me when you land. I love you. The gate agent, a woman in a fitted blazer and a neat bun, began speaking over the PA system, announcing pre-boarding for passengers needing extra time or traveling with young children. Jayden's eyes flicked to the boarding lanes again, scanning. The order posted on the small sign: first class priority, then zones 1 through 4. His ticket placed him right at the top of that list. But the idea of standing up first, walking past the rows of waiting passengers, made his stomach tighten. Still, when the agent called for first-class boarding, Jayden rose, sliding the boarding pass from its envelope and holding it carefully in his hand. He walked toward the gate, keeping his posture straight, trying to project the kind of quiet confidence he'd seen in people who traveled often. He could feel eyes on him against just a few, maybe but enough to make the space between each step feel longer. The agent glanced at his ticket, then up at him. Her expression didn't change, but her pause was a fraction longer than it should have been before she scanned the pass. The reader beeped, and she handed it back without comment. Jayden managed a polite nod and stepped forward toward the jet bridge. The cool air from the tunnel ahead rushed against his face, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of the aircraft waiting at the other end. He took a deep breath, telling himself this was the start of something exciting. He didn't notice at first. The man in uniform standing just inside the aircraft doorway? Not until the man's eyes locked onto him and his body shifted ever so slightly to block the narrow entrance. Jayden stepped off the moving walkway and into the gate area, pulling his carry-on close as the faint hum of conversations filled the space. The large windows behind the gate counter framed the nose of the plane, gleaming under the gray daylight spilling across the tarmac. The jet bridge stretched toward it like a narrow tunnel, and for a moment he felt a flicker of relief. He was almost there, almost in his seat. The boarding lanes were half full, most of the first-class passengers already gathered near the priority line. Jayden adjusted the strap of his backpack and joined the queue, careful to keep his ticket visible. In his hand, the small rectangle of paper still felt unreal, his name printed clearly above the words first class. The seat number 1A standing out in bold type. The gate attendant, a woman with a tight bun and a blazer so perfectly pressed it could have been new, scanned the crowd as they approached. She smiled at the older man ahead of him, exchanging a quick joke before scanning his pass with a cheerful beep. When it was Jayden's turn, the brightness in her eyes dimmed, almost imperceptibly. She took the pass from him without touching, his fingers, her nails tapping the cardstock lightly as if weighing it. Her gaze flicked to his face, then down to the ticket again. The pause was just long enough for him to notice. She lifted her head, her lips stretching into a polite smile. That didn't touch her eyes. "One moment, please," she said softly. Though her voice carried just enough to draw the attention of a man standing to her right, Jayden followed her glance. The man wore the navy blue uniform of a captain, his hat tucked under one arm. Build was solid, his posture rigid in a way that suggested a life built on procedure and control. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed to hold no warmth, narrowed the moment they landed on Jayden. The captain took in the teenager's clean shirt, dark jeans, and well-worn sneakers in a single sweep, his jaw tightening. The gate attendant handed the ticket back, her tone bright again, though her gaze slid briefly toward the captain. Ahead, she gestured toward the jet bridge. Jayden nodded his thanks and started forward. But the faint prickle between his shoulder blades told him the moment hadn't passed unnoticed. As he stepped toward the mouth of the jet bridge, the captain moved from where he'd been standing, positioning himself just inside the threshold of the aircraft door. Jayden caught the motion out of the corner of his eye, but kept walking, the wheels of his carry-on clicking against the ridged floor of the bridge. The hum of the terminal faded behind him, replaced by the quieter, cooler air that always seemed to hang in this narrow space between airport and airplane. The faint scent of jet fuel mixed with the sterile temps of cleaning chemicals. The closer he got to the door, the more he realized the captain wasn't just standing there, he was waiting. Jayden's steps slowed, uncertainty flickering in his chest. The man's gaze was fixed on him now, steady and unblinking. His pale eyes held a question, but not one that invited an answer. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision. The captain's free hand rested lightly on the doorframe, fingers splayed as if marking a boundary. His expression didn't change as Jayden reached him, but his body shifted just enough to block the narrow opening into the cabin. The movement was subtle, but there was no mistaking it. It was deliberate. Jayden opened his mouth to speak, but the captain's voice cut in first. Low, even, but carrying the kind of authority that made people stop without thinking. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" The request wasn't phrased as a question. Jayden hesitated, feeling the eyes of the flight attendant inside the cabin on him now. Slowly he handed the ticket over, his fingers tightening around the handle of his carry-on. The captain studied the paper, his gaze moving back and forth between it and Jayden's face. The silence stretched, broken only by the muffled sounds of passengers settling into their seats further inside. When the captain finally spoke again, the politeness in his tone had thinned to something cooler. "And your ID?" Jayden reached for his wallet, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sure." He handed over the card, watching the captain's eyes flicker to the birth date, the address, then back to him. Another pause. Another unblinking stare. Behind the captain, the first-class cabin gleamed wide leather seats, the soft glow of reading lights, the quiet murmur of passengers already sipping drinks. It was only a few steps away, but right now it felt out of reach. The captain handed back the ID and the boarding pass without a word, but his eyes stayed narrowed, as if the paper in Jayden's hand still didn't quite match the person standing before him. Jayden slid the ticket back into his pocket, forcing a small nod before stepping past the captain's shoulder into the cabin. The moment should have ended there, but he could feel it lingering, the unspoken question, the uninvited scrutiny following him down the aisle. The jet bridge was cooler than the terminal, the hum of the air conditioning blending with the faint metallic groan of the structure beneath Jayden's feet. His carry-on rolled behind him with a steady rhythm, the wheels clacking against the ridges in the floor. Ahead, the open doorway of the aircraft framed the pilot's broad shoulders, the man's hat now perched neatly on his head. Jayden kept his focus forward, thinking only of finding his seat and settling in before the flight took off. He was 3 steps from the entrance when the pilot moved, not a casual shift, but a deliberate step forward, enough to narrow the space and stop him cold. The man's expression was unreadable for a moment, his pale blue eyes scanning Jayden's face, then dropping briefly to his shirt, jeans, and sneakers. There was no smile, no welcome, just that unbroken stare. "You sure? You're in the right section, son." The pilot's voice was low but carried easily in the enclosed space, each word measured. Jayden blinked, thrown off by the question. "Yes, sir, first class." He patted the pocket where his ticket was tucked, a gesture meant to make the point. "Clear." The pilot's eyes narrowed slightly, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Let me see that again." Jayden pulled the ticket from his pocket and handed it over, watching as the man studied it like it might reveal something it hadn't a few minutes ago. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant murmur of passengers already seated inside. "ID 2, the pilot said after a beat. Jayden hesitated before reaching for his wallet. "I already showed it at the gate." The pilot didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to show it again." The firmness in his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Jayden handed over his ID, his fingers brushing the man's as he did. The pilot examined it closely, his gaze flicking between the card and Jayden's face. "This your ticket?" The question was blunt, almost flat, but there was a weight behind it that made Jayden's jaw tighten. "Yes," the pilot's eyes held on him a moment longer. "We've had situations before, okay? People trying to get into sections they don't belong in. Security concerns, you understand?" Jayden felt the words settle like a stone in his stomach. He glanced behind him. A few passengers had stopped on the jet bridge, held up by the interaction. Their eyes shifted between the pilot and him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something sharper. One man tilted his head as if trying to place what was happening. "I bought this ticket," Jayden said, his voice steady, but quieter now. He didn't raise it, didn't want to give anyone more reason to look, but he kept his gaze on the pilot's face. The man's jaw worked, as though deciding whether to believe him. "And where are you headed today?" Jayden named the destination. Printed clearly on the boarding pass, the pilot still held. The pilot didn't move right away. From inside the plane, the flight attendant by the door shifted her weight, glancing between them. She opened her mouth like she might say something, then closed it again. The hum of the air conditioning felt louder now, the cool air doing nothing to ease the heat crawling up the back of Jayden's neck. Finally, the pilot handed the ticket and ID back, his fingers lingering just long enough to make the moment feel deliberate. "All right," he said, though the lack of warmth in his voice left the words hollow. "Go ahead." Jayden slid the ID back into his wallet and stepped past him, feeling the man's gaze follow him into the cabin. The aisle felt narrower than it should have, the soft carpet muffling his footsteps as he moved toward his seat. Behind him, the murmur of conversation picked up again, but he knew a few passengers would keep watching. We could feel it in the way the space seemed to hum, not with the noise of the engines, but with the tension that had just been left hanging in the air. Jayden had barely taken a step into the cabin when the pilot's voice cut through the low hum of boarding passengers. It was sharper now, pitched just high enough to carry over the rustle of coats and the thud of bags sliding into overhead bins.
Sorry.
Second, the pilot said, his tone no longer just questioning but edged with something firmer.
Oh.
Jayden froze in the aisle, turning slightly to face him. The narrow doorway behind was still open to the jet bridge and a few people waiting to board. Leaned subtly forward, sensing something was happening. The pilot took a step closer, his shoulders squaring, his expression unreadable except for the way his eyes narrowed. This ticket, he held it up between two fingers. You're sure it's yours? Jayden felt the weight of every pair of eyes that had turned in their direction. Yes, he said evenly. I bought it. Well, it was bought for me, but it's mine. A faint scoff escaped the pilot, quick but audible. You'll forgive me if I need to be certain. First class isn't for everyone. The words landed with a heaviness that didn't need explanation. The phrasing wasn't outright, but it didn't have to be. It was enough to make heat climb up Jayden's neck. It is for me, Jayden replied, trying to keep his voice from shaking. The pilot didn't step aside. We've had situations before, he said, louder now, where tickets were stolen, borrowed, or he paused deliberately, purchased through less than honest means. When that happens, security gets involved. It's not pleasant. Someone in the first row shifted in their seat to get a better view. The murmuring on the jet bridge behind them grew more distinct. The kind of low voices people used when they wanted to seem discreet, but were eager for a piece of someone else's drama. Jayden's grip on his carry-on handle tightened. Ticket isn't stolen, he said. Maybe, the pilot answered, tilting his head slightly. Or maybe you're trying to take a seat that doesn't belong to you. First-class passengers are vetted. We know who's supposed to be here. I am supposed to be here, Jayden said again, this time with more weight behind the words. He took a half-step forward, but the pilot didn't move, his frame still blocking the narrow aisle entrance. The flight attendant by the galley shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two of them. She seemed on the verge of saying something, but stopped when the pilot's gaze flicked toward her briefly. Jayden could feel his heart thudding in his chest. He wanted to keep his voice calm, wanted to believe this would pass if he stayed steady. But the longer the pilot stood there, the more the humiliation seeped in. Every second stretched the moment further. Every sideways glance from a passenger felt like a silent judgment. I don't care who bought the ticket, the pilot said, finally, his voice dropping just enough to feel colder. If I think there's a problem, I have the authority to have you removed before we leave the gate. Understand? Jayden stared at him, jaw tight. There isn't a problem, he said. The pilot let the words hang between them for a beat, his eyes searching Jayden's face as if he might find proof of a lie there. Then, with a small shake of his head, he stepped back just enough to clear the way, but his gaze stayed fixed. You'd better hope not, he muttered. Not quite. Under his breath, before turning back toward the cockpit, Jayden moved down the aisle, feeling every stare on his back. The seat wide, polished, and possibly far from the boarding gate suddenly didn't feel like much of a prize. He sat down, buckled in, and kept his eyes forward, telling himself not to let the words stick, but they already had. Jayden had barely settled into his seat when the pilot reappeared at the front of the cabin. He wasn't in the cockpit, where passengers expected him to be, running through pre-flight checks and communicating with the tower. Instead, he stood just inside the doorway, his presence filling the space in a way that made conversations nearby falter. He spoke briefly to the lead flight attendant, his voice too low for Jayden to catch the words, but the way her expression tightened told him enough whatever was being said wasn't in his favor. The pilot's gaze swept the first-class cabin and landed on Jayden like it had been searching for him all along. Sir, he said, though there was no respect in the formality, I'm going to need you to come with me. Jayden frowned, his hands gripping the armrests. "Why?" "There's a problem with your ticket," the pilot replied, his tone clipped. "We're not going to resolve it here. You'll need to step off the aircraft." Jayden shook his head slowly, his voice calm but firm. "There's no problem with my ticket. I'm supposed to be here." The pilot's jaw worked, and his voice carried more force. "You can cooperate now, or I can call security. Okay, either way, you're not staying in that seat." The murmuring around them grew louder. Passengers shifted in their seats, leaning just enough to get a better look. Someone in the row across from Jayden muttered something under their breath, the kind of comment meant to be heard without being addressed. Jayden's chest tightened, could feel heat rising. Into his face, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice louder now, though it wavered at the edges. "You're making a mistake." The pilot didn't flinch, turned toward the galleon, gave a short nod to a uniformed airport security officer who had just stepped on board, drawn by the radio call. The officer, tall and broad-shouldered, moved down the aisle with an expression that was carefully neutral. The officer said, stopping beside Jayden's seat, "We're going to have to ask you to come with us." Jayden stared at him, feeling the pulse in his temples. "Why? What's the reason?" The officer's eyes flicked briefly toward the pilot before coming back to him. "They've raised a concern about your boarding status. We can talk about it outside." It was clear there was no real choice here. Staying seated would mean being dragged off, and Jayden could already imagine the phones coming out, the grainy videos hitting social media before the plane even left the gate. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt, his fingers stiff, and stood. The walk down the aisle felt impossibly long. The hum of the engines was still faint, the cabin air still cool, but Jayden's skin felt hot. Every passenger he passed seemed to follow him with their eyes, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment to something uncomfortably close to pity. The low murmur of conversation never stopped, it just shifted to follow him. When he stepped back onto the jet bridge, the air felt different, less contained, but heavier somehow. The security officer stayed just behind him, close enough that it was clear this wasn't voluntary. At the far end, the gate attendant glanced up from her computer, her expression flickering for just a second before smoothing into something bland and professional. Jayden stepped into the terminal, the open space of the concourse suddenly overwhelming. He moved toward a row of seats away from the boarding lane, his carry-on rolling behind him. His hands shook as he sat down, gripping the handle until his knuckles whitened. The security officer offered a brief nod before returning to the gate. The pilot was already out of sight, back inside the plane. Through the large window, Jayden could see passengers still boarding, their figures moving through the jet bridge one by one, stepping into a space that had just been denied to him. He stared at the floor, his pulse still hammering, the weight of what had just happened pressing in on his chest. It wasn't just the humiliation of being removed, it was the way every set of eyes had followed him, the unspoken conclusions, already drawn by people who didn't know him at all. Jayden sat in a molded plastic chair a few rows from the gate, his carry-on parked beside his leg, the handle jutting toward him like it might anchor him in place. The hum of the terminal felt louder here, a blend of rolling luggage wheels, muted boarding announcements, and the occasional sharp call of a child's voice cutting through the air. He kept his eyes on a scuff mark in the carpet, tracing its jagged edge with his gaze to avoid looking at anyone directly. The moment replayed in his head on a loop, the pilot's voice rising just enough for the cabin to hear, the shift of passengers' heads turning in unison, the heat crawling up his neck as the security officer stepped into the aisle. Each time he thought about it, a fresh wave of embarrassment hit, pressing him further back into the chair. He pressed his palms against his knees, trying to ground himself, but his fingers twitched restlessly. The gate area was busy but not crowded, and from where he sat, he could still see the counter. The flight attendant who had scanned his ticket earlier moved back and forth between the computer and the boarding lane, her expression fixed in a polite mask. Once, her eyes swept the area and landed on him for the briefest second. She looked away just as quickly, shifting her focus to the next passenger in line. Jayden wondered if she felt anything about what had happened, if she had seen enough to know the situation wasn't as simple as the pilot had made it. But she didn't approach, didn't speak to him, didn't offer even a small acknowledgement. It was as if the unwritten rule was to keep distance once someone had been marked as a problem. A pair of airport security officers stood near the corner of the gate area, their dark uniforms blending with the shadow cast by the large window. They weren't looking directly at him, but their position felt intentional, close enough to step in quickly if needed, far enough to appear casual. One of them spoke quietly into a radio, then glanced toward the jet bridge before resuming his idle stance. Jayden shifted in his seat, resisting the urge to pull out his phone. He didn't want to be seen recording or texting, didn't want to give anyone an excuse to think he was making trouble. Instead, he kept his hands folded loosely in his lap, his posture straight, the way his mother always told him to carry himself in public, especially in situations like this. Every so often, the boarding door closed for a moment and reopened to admit another passenger, usually one who had been called up from standby or a late arrival. Each time, Jayden's chest tightened a little. That should have been him in there. His seat was now filled by someone else, maybe already sipping a drink or scrolling through their phone without a second thought. The boarding process wound down, the last passengers disappearing into the jet bridge. The gate agent picked up the phone, speaking into it in a tone too low for him to catch. A moment later, she slid the door closed and turned away from the counter, her heels clicking against the tile as she walked off. Though Jayden stayed where he was, watching the plane through the large window as it pushed back from the gate. The engines roared to life, a deep vibration that seemed to travel through the floor into his feet. He kept his face still, refusing to let the frustration show more than it already had, but his jaw was tight enough to ache. The security officers didn't move until the plane was taxiing toward the runway. I gave a short nod in his direction, not friendly but not hostile, before following his partner toward another gate. Jayden let out a slow breath, the air feeling heavier as it left his lungs. Now, the waiting began, not just for the next flight, if there even would be one for him today, but for some kind of explanation. Something that would make sense of why he had been pulled from his seat and left here under watch, as if simply existing in the wrong place was enough to make him a threat. Jayden was still in the same seat, his carry-on at his side. When movement at the far end of the concourse caught his attention, a steady rhythm of footsteps echoed faintly over the hum of the terminal, a sound too even and deliberate to belong to someone rushing to catch a flight. The figure came into clearer view as he drew closer. Man in his mid-40s, tall, with the kind of posture that suggested he was used to owning the space he walked into. His clothes were simple but precise, a tailored travel jacket in charcoal, gray, dark slacks, and a pair of polished leather shoes that seemed to find a path through the crowd without effort. People noticed him. Not in the way they noticed a celebrity or someone making a scene, but in the way they noticed someone who didn't have to explain why he was there. A businessman rolling his suitcase slowed just enough to glance back after. Passing him, to gate agents at a nearby counter, paused their conversation for a beat as he walked by. He didn't return their looks, didn't break stride, his focus fixed ahead on the gate where Jayden had been pulled off the plane less than an hour ago. Jayden sat a little straighter without meaning to. There was nothing familiar about the man's face, but there was something in his presence, quiet, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and no one could rush him, that made it hard to look away. The man reached the gate counter and slid a boarding pass across to the attendant without a word. She glanced down at it, then up at him, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. The change was small, a slight softening in her posture, a polite brightness in her tone as she greeted him, but it was enough to notice. Jayden recognized her. She was the same attendant who had scanned his ticket earlier, the one who had avoided meeting his eyes after he'd been escorted out. She checked the man's pass quickly, the scanner beeping in approval. There was no pause this time, no second look, no quiet call to the pilot waiting nearby. The man didn't ask about upgrades, didn't hover by the counter, didn't need to. The way he stood, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his small carry-on, made it seem like everything that was supposed to happen here would happen on his terms. The attendant returned the pass, her smile steady but a touch more genuine than the one she'd worn for anyone else. Without looking at the waiting passengers, the man stepped toward the jet bridge. His pace remained the same as it had been. Walking through the terminal, hurried, measured, as if the schedule would bend for him if it needed to. Jayden found himself following the movement without even thinking about it, his gaze fixed on the man until he disappeared from sight down the narrow tunnel. There was no hesitation in him, no check over his shoulder, no sense that he might be stopped. It was as though the possibility of being questioned hadn't even occurred to him. Around Jayden, the terminal moved on, as it always did. Announcements. 4 other flights buzzed over the PA system. A child laughed somewhere near the coffee kiosk. But his focus stayed on the space where the man had just been, and on the thought that someone who carried themselves like that seemed to operate under a completely different set of rules. He didn't know yet that the man had a connection to him, that this calm, confident stranger was walking into the same cabin he had been forced to leave. All he knew was that watching him pass through the gate without a single obstacle made the knot in his chest pull tighter. It was proof, in real time, of how easily the path cleared when the right person was holding the ticket. The man had almost disappeared down the jet bridge when something made him slow. His carry-on rolled to a stop beside him as he turned his head, scanning the rows of seats in the gate area with the faintest crease between his brows. His eyes passed over a few passengers before settling on Jayden. The pause was immediate, his posture shifting just slightly, like he had caught sight of something that didn't belong where it was. For a moment, the man didn't move. His gaze stayed on Jayden, the crease deepening as though he were sorting through a memory, trying to match the teenager in front of him with some earlier version fixed in his mind. Jayden felt the attention like a weight pressing into his shoulders. He sat still, unsure if he should look away or meet it head-on. The recognition came slowly, but definitively. The man's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with something closer to realization. His mouth set into a firm line, the kind of expression that came when a puzzle piece finally clicked into place. Jayden's chest tightened. There was no reason for this man to know him more, at least. No reason Jayden could think of, but the look on his face said otherwise. He shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers curling around the edge of his carry-on. A part of him wanted to speak, to ask outright why this stranger was staring at him. But another part warned against it, telling him to wait, to see what would happen next. The man glanced once toward the gate door, the plane waiting beyond it, before making his decision. He let go of the carry-on handle and walked back into the seating area, his steps unhurried but direct. Passengers sitting nearby turned their heads to follow the movement, sensing the purposeful energy in it. Jayden's grip on his bag tightened. As the man drew closer, he could feel his own posture stiffen, his back pressing against the plastic chair. When the man stopped in front of him, the closeness was enough to make the surrounding hum of the terminal dim for a second. "Are you Brooks?" The man asked, his voice steady and deep, carrying the kind of certainty that suggested he already knew the answer. Jayden's eyes flickered in surprise. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "I'm Jayden Brooks." The man's gaze sharpened at the confirmation. He nodded once, as if ticking off a box in his mind. "I thought so," he murmured, almost to himself. Then more directly, "Why are you sitting out here? You're supposed to be on that flight." Jayden hesitated, searching the man's face for some hint of who he was and why he cared. He said finally. "The pilot said there was a problem. Made me get off." The man's eyes narrowed again, though this time with a flash of something closer to irritation. "A problem with what?" "My ticket," Jayden answered, his voice tightening. "He said it might be stolen, that I didn't belong in first class." For the first time, the man's composure shifted, his jaw clenched, and he looked back toward the gate as if he might still see the pilot standing there. His hand curled, briefly at his side before relaxing again. When he looked at Jayden, the calm was back in place, but it felt sharper now, more deliberate. "You're in seat 1A, he said, the words more like a statement of fact than a question. Jayden blinked. "Yeah, that's what it said, and that's where you'll be sitting," the man replied simply. Without another word, he reached for the handle of his carry-on and turned toward the gate, his stride purposeful now. Jayden sat frozen for half a second before standing quickly, unsure if he should follow, but drawn by the quiet authority in the man's tone. Around them, the terminal noise returned in full force, but Jayden barely heard it. The man moved like someone used to getting answers, and Jayden had the sudden, uneasy feeling that whatever was about to happen would not be left unresolved. The man stood over him with a presence that made the noise of the terminal seem to fade. His eyes were sharp, deliberate in the way they searched Jayden's face, as if looking for confirmation of something he already suspected. "You're Brooks?" he asked, the words clipped, not unkind, but leaving no room for misunderstanding. Jayden blinked, thrown by the question. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "Jayden Brooks." His voice carried a mix of confusion and curiosity. He didn't know this man, had never seen him before in his life, but there was something in the way he asked that made it sound like the name meant something. The man's gaze didn't waver. A muscle in his jaw tightened as he processed that answer. "Why are you sitting here?" he asked, glancing at the empty chair beside Jayden and then toward the closed boarding door of the gate. Jayden shifted, the question brushing against the raw edge of the last hour. "They took me off the plane," he said finally. "The pilot said there was a problem with my ticket." The man's brow furrowed, his expression shifting from curiosity to something heavier, darker. "What kind of problem?" Jayden hesitated. Saying it out loud made it feel even more humiliating. Said it might be stolen. That I didn't belong in first class. The words came out quiet, but steady. He forced himself to keep eye contact, even though every instinct told him to look away. The man's expression didn't just darken, it hardened. His eyes flicked briefly toward the gate, as though he could still see the pilot standing there, and his shoulders straightened with a controlled tension. "Who told you that?" "The pilot," Jayden said, his voice low. "He stopped me. Before I could get to my seat, asked for my ID again. Then he said there were security concerns. Next thing I knew, security was walking me off." The man drew in a slow breath through his nose, holding it for a moment before letting it out. His calm was deliberate, a mask he seemed to wear by choice, but Jayden could see the flicker of something sharper beneath it. "You're supposed to be in seat 1A, the man said, his tone leaving no doubt. Jayden blinked again, unsure if he'd heard him right. "That's what my ticket said," he admitted cautiously. But I didn't even make it past the first row." The man looked down at him for another long moment, his expression unreadable, but his presence heavy with intent. Then he shifted his stance, turning slightly toward the gate. "And yet you're sitting out here," he said, almost to himself. The words carrying a weight that suggested he found the situation unacceptable. Jayden didn't know what to say to that. His hands tightened around the handle of his carry-on, the memory of the stares and whispers from the plane still sharp in his mind. Part of him wanted to ask outright who this man was and why it mattered to him. But the way he carried himself, the steady, measured tone, the absence of doubt, kept Jayden quiet. The man finally looked back at him, his eyes steady. "Wait." "Here," he said, though there was no question in it. Then he turned toward the counter, his stride purposeful, his focus fixed on the attendant behind the podium. Jayden watched him go, his confusion deepening with each step the man took toward the place where everything had gone wrong. He didn't know who this man was, but the certainty in his voice when he said, "You're supposed to be in seat 1A," felt like more than just an observation. It sounded like a decision, one that someone like this was used to making and making stick. The man didn't waste a second once the words had left his mouth. He turned from Jayden with a smooth, deliberate motion, his carry-on trailing behind him as he headed for the gate counter. His stride was steady, not rushed, but there was a firmness in it that made people move out of his way without realizing why. Jayden stayed where he was, eyes following every step. The gate attendant noticed him approaching and straightened slightly, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. She greeted passengers for a living. She was used to managing tense situations. With a smile, but there was something different about the way she reacted to him. Her expression shifted, not with recognition exactly, but with the quick, wary alertness of someone who knew instinctively that the person walking toward them wasn't here to make small talk. He stopped at the counter, resting one hand on the edge and leaning forward just slightly, not enough to invade her space, but enough to close the distance in a way that made it impossible for her to treat him like any other passenger. "I need to speak to your pilot," he said. The words were calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in them. The attendant blinked. I'm sorry, sir. The aircraft is preparing for departure. If this is about a passenger issue, it is, he cut in, still level but more deliberate now. And it concerns a decision your pilot made before boarding was complete. I'll need him here now. Her hands hovered above the keyboard, unsure whether to type or reach for the phone. The faint hum of voices in the waiting area seemed to drop a notch as nearby passengers tuned in. The attendant's eyes flickered briefly toward the closed boarding door, then back to him. Sir, can I ask what this is regarding? You can, he said, his gaze unwavering. It's about a passenger who was removed from his rightful seat, one without cause. That passenger is still sitting in your gate area, and he should be on that plane. The words landed with a weight that made her posture stiffen. She didn't ask who he meant. She didn't need to. Her eyes shifted over his shoulder, just for a second, toward where Jayden sat. The man noticed the glance, but didn't comment on it. The pilot, he repeated, softer now, but with no less force. Please. The attendant swallowed once, her throat moving quickly, and picked up the phone. Kept her voice low, just under the hum of the terminal, but Jayden caught the sharp efficiency in her tone. Her gaze didn't meet his again. The man stayed at the counter, waiting. He didn't fidget, didn't pace, didn't look around like someone trying to pass the time. His stillness was the kind that filled space, the kind that made silence feel intentional. Jayden could see the way her fingers tightened slightly on the phone receiver as she spoke. Could see how her eyes darted toward the jet bridge again. A minute later, she hung up, pressing her lips together before speaking. He's coming. The man gave a small nod, the acknowledgement brisk, and stepped back just enough to give the pilot room when he arrived. Jayden's stomach twisted, half from nerves and half from something else, something like the first flicker of hope since he'd been taken off the plane. He had no idea what this man planned to say, but the air between the counter and the seating area felt different now. The quiet authority in his voice had shifted the room, and even from his seat, Jayden could feel it. The pilot emerged from the jet bridge with the same upright posture Jayden had seen earlier, his cap perched just so, his expression composed. But there was a stiffness in his step now, as if he had been pulled from a task he'd considered more important. His eyes scanned the gate area briefly before settling on the man waiting at the counter. The man didn't step forward immediately. He let the pilot come to him, the distance closing in slow, even strides. Passengers nearby pretended to keep reading their phones or sipping their coffee, but their attention was fixed on the unfolding. Seen? You asked to see me? The pilot said, his tone clipped. I did, the man replied, his voice calm, but carrying a resonance that seemed to quiet the space around them. He didn't lower it, didn't match the pilot's clipped tone. Instead, he spoke with the measured clarity of someone used to commanding rooms far larger than this gate area. I believe you removed a passenger from seat 1A earlier, he continued. His eyes didn't leave the pilot's face. A young man. The pilot's gaze flickered for just a second, then steadied. There were security concerns. We've had incidents before, the man cut in, not with sharpness, but with precision. You may not be aware, he said evenly, that this is not a standard commercial flight. The pilot's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His jaw worked once before he replied. It's operated under the airline's domestic charter division. That's right, the man said. That aircraft is part of a private fleet, leased to this airline for corporate clients. He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. It belongs to my company. Which means, Captain, that you were flying my plane. The pilot didn't speak right away. Jayden, still in his seat a few rows back, felt his breath catch. The man's tone hadn't changed. But the effect was immediate, like a card had just been laid on the table that no one else could match. I'm not sure I follow, the pilot said finally, though there was less firmness in his voice now. You don't need to follow, the man replied. You need to understand. The passenger you removed was traveling as my guest, he held. A valid ticket issued under my company's account. That ticket placed him in seat 1A because that is where I wanted him. The gate attendant at the counter kept her eyes on her screen, fingers motionless on the keyboard. It was clear she had no intention of inserting herself into this conversation. The pilot straightened, but the movement felt defensive rather than authoritative now. If there was a misunderstanding, there was no misunderstanding. The man said, still without raising his voice, "You saw someone you didn't expect to see in that seat and decided he didn't belong there. You were wrong. You made that judgment on my aircraft, without cause, in front of other passengers." The silence that followed was heavier than the steady hum of the terminal could mask. Even those pretending not to listen seemed to lean closer without moving. The man stepped slightly closer, just enough to make his presence more direct. "That plane leaves when I say it leaves," he said. "It doesn't leave without him on board." The pilot's gaze flickered again, this time toward the gate attendant, then back to the man. His posture eased by degrees, the rigid authority replaced by something closer to resignation. "I'll have him reboarded," he said. "Do that," the man replied, already turning his head toward where Jayden sat. The briefest glint of reassurance crossed his expression before it settled back into that same steady composure. "And make sure his seat is exactly where it should be." Jayden felt the air in his chest loosen for the first time since he'd been pulled from the plane.
Oh.
The man wasn't just getting him back on board, he was making it clear that this wasn't a favor, it was a correction. The gate area had gone quieter than it should have for this time of day. The normal rhythm of rolling luggage, boarding announcements, and idle chatter seemed to dull as the man turned slightly, making sure his voice carried just enough for those within earshot. He kept his posture relaxed, but there was nothing casual. In his words, "Captain," he began, his tone level, but edged with something that made the air feel tighter. "Perhaps you can explain to me, here and now, why my guest was removed from his seat." The gate attendant froze, mid-keystroke. She didn't look up, but her stillness gave her away. The pilot's jaw shifted once before he answered. "As I said before, there were security protocols in place. We had to be certain about the passengers' status." "Security protocols," the man repeated slowly, letting the phrase turn over in the space between them. "For a ticket issued under my company's account, for a guest listed by name on the manifest, you had to be certain about that." The pilot's mouth tightened. "We've had incidents before. The man didn't let him finish." "Doubt you've had incidents," he said, his voice still even. "But I'm struggling to understand how your protocols allow for removing a confirmed passenger without so much as verifying that information with the account holder, which, in this case, would have been me." The gate attendant's eyes flickered upward for just a second, and then back to her screen. Jayden sat a short distance away, his hands folded tightly in his lap, feeling every word as if it were aimed at unwinding the knot still lodged in his chest. The pilot shifted his weight, his shoulders stiff. He made a judgment call based on the situation. "A judgment call," the man echoed, his voice dropping slightly. "The way someone does when they want the next words to land harder. And that judgment was that a 17-year-old with a valid ticket did not belong in first class." The pilot's eyes narrowed, but there was no rebuttal ready on his tongue. He glanced briefly toward the gate attendant, as if expecting her to step in, but she kept her gaze firmly fixed on her monitor. "I've flown often enough to know when security is the real concern," the man continued, his tone measured, and when it's simply a pretext. This, he gestured toward Jayden without turning to look at him, was the latter. "You didn't ask questions? You didn't confirm his details? You simply decided he wasn't supposed to be there?" The pause that followed was thick. A man in the waiting area coughed lightly, the sound echoing more than it should have. The pilot cleared his throat. "If I misjudged the situation, you did," the man said, cutting through without hesitation. "And you did it on my plane to someone who had every right to be there." There was no heat in his voice, but there was no softness either. It was the kind of tone that didn't need to rise to be heard, the kind that carried the weight of someone used to closing discussions rather than prolonging them. The pilot's gaze shifted away, the stiffness in his posture betraying a concession. He didn't want to speak aloud. The man held him there a moment longer, eyes steady, before finally straightening. "Have him reboarded," he said, the words landing like a final line in a contract. The pilot gave a tight nod and stepped back, toward the jet bridge, his shoulders rigid. The man didn't watch him go. Instead, he turned toward the gate attendant, who was already reaching for the phone. The hum of the terminal began to return. But the echo of the exchange lingered in the air, as if the space itself had taken note of what had just been said. The pilot had barely disappeared back into the jet bridge when the man turned toward Jayden. His expression didn't soften, but the focus in his eyes shifted. It's no longer aimed at the gate staff or the shrinking figure of the captain. He gave a small, deliberate tilt of his head, the kind of gesture that needed no words. "Come on," he said quietly, but it carried an expectation that Jayden would follow without hesitation. Jayden rose from his seat, the legs of his carry-on scraping softly against the carpet as he pulled it upright. For a second his body still felt heavy from the hour of sitting under silent watch. But the command in the man's tone cut through the weight. He fell into step behind him, the distance between them closing until they were side by side. The gate attendant had the boarding door open by the time they reached the counter, her eyes fixed firmly on the computer screen. She scanned Jayden's ticket without looking up, the beep loud in the otherwise muted space. No comment, no apology, just a brisk motion to wave them forward. As they stepped toward the jet bridge, the shift in the atmosphere around them was impossible to miss. Conversations in the waiting area dimmed. Heads turned. A few passengers leaned slightly out of their seats for a better view. There were whispers low, fast, impossible to catch entirely, but Jayden could feel their edges, could hear the shape of them in the way people's eyes moved between him and the man walking beside him. The man didn't acknowledge the stares. His stride was steady, his suitcase rolling with an even rhythm over the ridged floor of the jet bridge. Jayden tried to match his pace, the sound of his own wheels falling into sync. The narrow walls around them carried the echo of their steps. And for the first time since he'd been escorted off the plane, that sound wasn't laced with the weight of humiliation. Still, it wasn't gone entirely. Jayden's mind flickered back to the moment the pilot had blocked his path. The press of eyes on his back as he'd walked off the plane under the watch of security. But now there was something else under it. It's something. Like the first stirrings of relief, cautious and unfamiliar. Halfway down the bridge, the man spoke without looking over. "You'll be in your original seat," he said, his tone final. 1A, no one else. Jayden nodded, unsure if the man wanted a response. The number felt strange in his head now, tied to both the moment he had been removed and this unexpected return. As they reached the aircraft door, the same flight attendant who had stood by earlier was waiting. Her eyes flickered between them quickly before she stepped aside, her posture straightening. "Welcome back," she said to Jayden, the words polite but carrying no trace of warmth. The man didn't pause. He stepped into the first-class cabin as if reclaiming territory, and Jayden followed. The space looked the same as before, wide leather seats, the quiet murmur of passengers already settled, but it felt different now. People looked up from their tablets and magazines as they passed, some glancing away quickly, others holding their gaze a moment too long. Jayden kept his eyes forward, focusing on the row ahead until they reached it. The man stopped, gesturing toward the seat nearest the window. "Yours," he said simply. Jayden slid into it, placing his bag under the seat in front of him. The man took the seat beside him. It's not in the easy manner of a stranger striking up conversation, but with the familiarity of someone who belonged there and had no need to prove it. As he buckled his seatbelt, Jayden felt the lingering traces of humiliation still there, but dulled now, softened by the reality that he was back where he was supposed to be. The whispers from the gate seemed far away, fading into the low hum of the cabin. For the first time that day, the possibility of making it to his destination without further incident felt real. And sitting beside the man who had put him back in the seat, he began to wonder just who exactly he was. The man didn't take his seat right away. Instead, as soon as they stepped past the aircraft doorway, he paused just inside the first-class cabin, setting his carry-on neatly beside him. The lead flight attendant approached with the kind of professional smile that was designed to be both warm and non-intrusive. But there was an alertness in her eyes, like she was still trying to gauge the tone of whatever this was going to be. The man gestured toward Jayden with an open hand, his voice calm but carrying clearly enough for the nearby passengers and crew to hear. "This is Jayden Brooks," he said. "He's my personal guest on this flight. He'll be in 1A. The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. The attendant's smile didn't just stay in place, it changed, softened into something that looked less like formality and more like genuine attentiveness. "Of course," she said, inclining her head slightly toward Jayden. "Welcome, Mr. Brooks. If there's anything you need, please let us know." Jayden nodded, unsure what else to do. He noticed the way the other attendants, who had been moving quietly between the galley and the cabin, now turned their attention toward him. There was no hesitation in their glances, no lingering look that questioned whether he was in the right place. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable, the kind of unspoken change that didn't need to be announced to be felt. The man moved with unhurried precision, placing his carry-on in the overhead bin before stepping aside to let Jayden into the row. As Jayden slid into his seat, he caught the way one attendant was already offering a pre-departure drink, her tone light and friendly, as if they had been expecting him all along. It was a sharp contrast to the way things had been earlier. Before, there had been a caution in their movements, a watchfulness that carried the quiet implication of suspicion. Now, there was an ease, a practiced comfort in their gestures and words, as if his presence had been reframed entirely by the man's introduction. The man settled into the seat beside him and accepted a glass of water from the attendant with a nod. He didn't look at Jayden, didn't need to. The point had been made in the few words he'd spoken when they boarded. Jayden sat back against the leather, still processing the shift. The same people who had watched him walk off the plane under the eye of security were now offering him small courtesies, with the kind of efficiency reserved for those who belonged here. He thanked the attendant quietly when she placed a glass of orange juice on the small table in front of him. She smiled again, polite, warm, and entirely different from the unreadable expressions he'd received the first time he'd stepped on board. The cabin settled back into its rhythm, passengers adjusting their seats, scrolling through phones, or glancing at the safety cards tucked into the seat pockets. But Jayden remained aware of the undercurrent, the way perception had shifted, because one man with the right authority had chosen to name him as his guest. It hadn't been an explanation, or an argument, or a defense. It had been a simple statement, and that was enough to change the way people looked at him. He sipped the juice slowly, the chill of it grounding him. The man beside him closed his eyes briefly, as if already half detached from the noise of the cabin, but Jayden knew he wasn't unaware. Nothing about the way he moved suggested he missed much. For Jayden, the sense of relief was tempered by something else in awareness, that this change in treatment wasn't about him suddenly being seen for who he was. It was about who had chosen to stand beside him, whose voice had claimed him as someone worth accommodating. And as much as it eased the knot in his stomach, it left another truth sitting heavy in the back of his mind, that without that voice, without that introduction, the cabin might still see him the way it had an hour ago. The engine's low rumble deepened, a steady vibration threading through the floor beneath Jayden's shoes. Outside the window, the tarmac blurred with motion service carts retreating, a luggage loader pulling away, the wing's edge cutting sharply against the pale afternoon sky. Jayden's seatbelt was fastened tight, the cool leather pressing against his shoulders as he leaned slightly toward the window. His hands rested on his knees, fingers loosely curled, his gaze fixed on the ground rolling past. The man beside him didn't speak, sat comfortably, one arm resting on the armrest, the other settled in his lap. His presence was steady, but not imposing, a quiet constant in the narrow space they shared. Every so often, Jayden could feel the faint weight of his glance, quick, unobtrusive, as if checking for signs that he was all right without making it a performance. The safety announcements murmured through the cabin, the lead flight attendant's voice calm and practiced. Jayden half listened, his focus still pulled to the changing view beyond the glass. The plane eased forward, joining the slow procession toward the runway. He could see other aircraft lined up ahead, their tails rising like markers against the horizon. The air inside the cabin felt warmer now, scented faintly with the mix of leather, coffee, and whatever the crew used to freshen. The space before boarding. He didn't say anything. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the words in his head felt tangled. The events of the last hour still hovered close, being stopped at the doorway, questioned, pulled from his seat, walking back into the terminal under the gaze of strangers. The memory clung to him, as persistent as the faint thrum of the engines. When the plane reached the end of the runway and paused, Jayden exhaled slowly, his breath fogging a faint patch of the window. The engine surged, the sound building until it filled the cabin, pressing into his chest. The force pushed him gently back into his seat as the ground outside rushed into a blur. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, watching the runway lights streak past until the view tilted, the horizon slipping downward as the aircraft lifted into the air. The city unfolded beneath them in sharp lines and patches of color roads winding like dark ribbons. Rooftops glinting in the sunlight, a river cutting a wide path through the sprawl. Jayden watched until the details softened, the ground turning into a patchwork of fields and clusters of buildings, clouds gathering at the edges of his vision. The man hadn't spoken since they'd left the gate, but Jayden could still feel the quiet tether between them. It wasn't the strained silence of strangers forced to sit side by side. It was the kind of silence that made space. When Jayden shifted slightly in his seat, the man glanced over, his expression unreadable but intent. Seeing nothing in Jayden's face that required words, he looked away again, letting the moment settle back into quiet. Jayden rested his forehead lightly against the window. The cool glass was grounding, the soft vibration of the engines traveling through it into his skin. The hum of the cabin was steady, now pages turning, a faint click of seatbelt buckles being adjusted, the occasional chime from the overhead panel. Somewhere in the midst of it, Jayden realized he was grateful for the absence of questions. The man hadn't asked for an explanation, hadn't filled the air with reassurances or platitudes. He had simply acted, and now he was giving Jayden the room to sit with the space between what had happened and where they were now. The plane banked gently, the wing tipping toward the sunlight. Jayden's reflection faintly overlapped the view. Outside, and in the glass, he caught another fleeting glance from the man beside him. Quick, almost imperceptible check before his attention returned to the quiet landscape below. The steady hum of the engines had settled into the kind of background noise that almost disappeared if you let your mind drift. The plane was cruising smoothly now, sunlight streaming through the oval windows in long, pale bands that cut across the cabin. A flight attendant moved quietly down the aisle, checking on passengers with the ease of someone who knew how to work without drawing attention. Jayden had loosened his grip on the armrest and was now leaning back, the initial tension in his shoulders easing bit by bit. He had been staring at the clouds for so long that they had blurred into an indistinct white sea. His thoughts floating somewhere between relief at being back in his seat and the lingering unease of what had led to him leaving it in the first place. The man beside him set down his glass of water on the small tray between them. He didn't speak right away, as if considering whether now was the right time. When he did, his voice was low, but clear enough to cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. "I knew your father," he said. Jayden turned his head slowly, unsure if he'd heard him correctly. "My dad?" The man nodded once, his eyes steady. "On Jayden's? We worked together. He was more than just a colleague. He was a friend. One of the best I've had." He paused for a moment, as though measuring the weight of the words. "We built a business together back before you were born. We didn't agree on everything, but when it came to loyalty, trust, there was no one I respected more." Jayden blinked, trying to reconcile the image of his father he had grown up with, a quiet, steady man who kept most of his work life private, with the fact that this stranger was speaking about him with such familiarity. "I didn't know he had business partners like that," he said quietly. "Your father didn't talk much about himself," the man replied. "He was focused on you, on your family. But he and I stayed in touch for years, even after he stepped away from the company. We spoke often." His gaze shifted briefly to the window, then back. "When he passed, I told myself I'd find a way to do something for you. Something he would have wanted." Jayden frowned slightly. "This trip?" The man nodded again. "It's not just a trip. This was meant as a gift for you for what you've achieved. I heard about your academic record. Top of your class, accepted into a program most kids wouldn't even think to apply to." There was no flattery in his tone, just a statement of fact. "Your father would have been proud. I wanted you to know that." The words sat heavy in Jayden's chest. He shifted slightly in his seat, unsure where to look.
"So you arranged?"
"All of this? The ticket? The flight? Everything?" "I did," the man said simply. "Under my company's account? That's why what happened back there was unacceptable. You weren't just another passenger. You were invited. You had every right to be in that seat from the moment you stepped into the terminal." Jayden looked down at his hands, his fingers loosely laced together. He thought about the way people had looked at him when he was escorted off, about the quiet judgment in their eyes. He thought about how quickly it had all changed when this man appeared, and now he understood why. "I didn't expect," Jayden started, then trailed off. I didn't think anyone would do something like this for me." The man's expression softened, though only slightly. "Your father earned my respect a long time ago. You've earned your own. This is just my way of honoring both." Jayden didn't know how to respond to that, so he nodded, letting the silence return. The hum of the engines filled the space between them again. But it felt different now, less like background noise. It's more like a steady reminder that the ground was far below, and that he was here in this seat because of a connection that had started long before he had even understood it existed. The landing gear touched down with a muted thump, the familiar jolt traveling up through the cabin floor. The engines roared in reverse, the pitch lowering as the plane slowed along the runway. Jayden kept his gaze out the window, watching the blur of tarmac give way to the slow roll toward the terminal. The flight attendants moved through the final safety reminders, their voices calm, professional, as if the hours before had been uneventful. When the plane came to a stop at the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers began their slow shuffle into the aisle. The man beside Jayden didn't move. He remained seated, watching the line advance toward the open door. When the cabin thinned out and only a few people remained, he turned toward Jayden. "Wait for me in the seating area just past the gate," he said. His tone was direct but not hurried. "I won't be long." Jayden nodded, sensing there was nothing to ask. They stepped off the aircraft together, the man giving a brief nod to the flight attendant at the door. The jet bridge was quiet now, the rush of voices from the gate area ahead. When they reached it, the man paused for a moment, scanning the space. Then he gestured toward an empty row of seats. "Sit there. I'll find you when I'm done." Jayden sat, his carry-on at his feet, watching as the man walked toward a glass-walled conference room just off the gate area. Two men in suits were already waiting inside, their posture straight, their attention shifting immediately as he entered. One of them closed the door behind him, but the glass didn't keep out everything. Through the faint hum of the terminal, Jayden could hear the man's voice. It wasn't loud, but it carried, measured, even, but with an edge that made each word sound like it was anchored in place. Couldn't catch all of it, just fragments. Unacceptable judgment. Guest of mine, corporate account. No verification before removal. The executives didn't interrupt often. When they did, their voices were quieter, more deferential. Jayden shifted slightly in his seat, glancing toward the jet bridge. The last of the ground crew was stepping away from the plane, the cabin door now closed again, as preparations began for its next departure. The pilot was not among them. The meeting inside the conference room stretched on. The man's voice steady, never rising, but each sentence delivered with the kind of clarity that made it impossible to dismiss. A flight attendant passed by and glanced toward the room, her expression tightening briefly before she moved on. When the door finally opened, the two executives stepped out first. Their faces were composed, but there was a stiffness to their movements, as if they were eager to put distance between themselves and the conversation they had just left. The man followed, his expression unchanged, his stride unhurried. He didn't look toward the jet bridge or the plane. Instead, he walked directly back to where Jayden was sitting. "Let's go," he said, lifting the handle of his carry-on. As they passed the gate counter, Jayden noticed a new crew member standing there, a pilot's uniform crisp, cap tucked neatly under one arm. It wasn't the same man who had questioned him, stopped him, and sent him back to the terminal hours ago. That man was nowhere in sight. They moved into the main concourse, the steady stream of travelers parting and closing around them. Jayden didn't ask what had been said in that room, but he didn't need to. The absence of the original pilot said enough. Whatever had happened behind those glass doors, it had been final. The concourse was still busy, a steady rhythm of rolling luggage and overlapping announcements carrying through the air. When the man slowed his stride near the gate they had just left, Jayden followed his gaze toward the counter, where the gate attendant now stood alongside one of the men who had been in the glass-walled meeting room earlier. The man's suit was sharp, his tie knotted perfectly. But there was a faint tension in his posture that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. The suited man glanced around, clearly searching for someone, and his eyes landed on Jayden. He stepped forward, the gate attendant close behind him. Passengers lingering in the seating area looked up, their conversations pausing as the small group came together in the open space by the counter. "Mr. Brooks," the suited man said, his voice polite but pitched to carry just enough to the onlookers nearby. Jayden nodded, feeling the weight of every set of eyes on him. "Yes, I'm Michael Turner, Regional Operations Director for the airline," the man said. "On behalf of our company, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for what happened. Earlier today, the way the situation was handled was inappropriate, and it does not reflect our values or standards." He spoke with practiced formality, but there was something careful in his tone, as though he knew each word would be measured by those listening. Passengers who had been at the gate during the earlier confrontation were clearly tuned in, some watching openly, others stealing glances between their phones. Jayden stood still, his hands loosely. Gripping the handle of his carry-on, he could feel the man beside him, the one who had intervened, standing just to his left, silent but present. Turner continued, "You had a valid ticket. You were entitled to your seat, and you should not have been removed from the aircraft. We regret the distress this caused you and the impression it left on others." The gate attendant, who had avoided his eyes before, now looked directly at him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice quieter but still audible to the surrounding seats. Jayden didn't speak immediately. The apology was public, visible, and in front of many of the same faces that had watched him escorted off the plane. There was a flicker of vindication in that proof that he hadn't been in the wrong, that the quiet humiliation he'd carried down the jet bridge hadn't been his to bear. But it came tangled with something heavier, the memory of the whispers. The stares, the tightening in his chest as security walked him away, those things didn't dissolve just because someone in a suit said the words "we're sorry." Turner extended a small envelope toward him. "We'd also like to offer compensation for the disruption and the way you were treated." Jayden took it, the cardstock cool between his fingers. He didn't open it, didn't need to know what was inside right now. His eyes lifted instead to meet Turner's. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his voice steady. "But what I really hope is that this doesn't happen to the next person." There was a murmur from somewhere in the seating area, the sound of agreement. Turner inclined his head slightly. "We are reviewing the incident to make sure it doesn't." The man beside Jayden gave a small nod, and Turner took that as his cue to step back. The gate attendant returned to the counter, her movements brisk, her eyes lowered. Slowly, the space around them began to refill with the usual sounds of travel boarding calls. Rolling suitcases, the low hum of conversation. As they walked away, Jayden glanced once over his shoulder. A few passengers were still watching him, their expressions unreadable. The public apology had set the record straight for anyone paying attention. But the feeling that had settled in him earlier, the sharp awareness of how quickly perception could shift, remained. He carried it with him as they left the gate, along with the quiet knowledge that the apology was only part of what he needed to make sense of the day. They moved away from the gate, the noise of the terminal stretching around them again, boarding calls, echoing from distant speakers. The rolling hum of luggage wheels on tile, the muffled chatter of travelers passing in every direction, kept pace beside the man, the envelope from the airline still in his hand, unopened. He wasn't sure where they were headed until the man slowed near a quieter corner out of the main flow of people. For a moment, they just stood there. The man glanced toward the nearby windows where sunlight poured across the polished floor, catching the faint lines of planes taxiing in the distance. Then he turned back to Jayden, his expression as calm as it had been since the moment they met, but with a weight behind it now, like he'd been waiting for the right time to speak. "You handled yourself well today," he said. "Better than most would have, considering what happened." Jayden shifted his grip on the handle of his carry-on, unsure how to respond. I didn't know what else to do," he said. "Finally, that's part of it," the man replied. "Knowing when to stand your ground and when to let the moment pass. I also saw how you spoke to me, how you answered my questions without letting frustration get the better of you. Matters more than you realize." Jayden didn't say anything, but his eyes narrowed slightly in curiosity. The man's tone wasn't casual. It carried the same precision he'd used when addressing the pilot and the airline executives. "I'm not in the habit of offering this," the man continued, "but I'd like you to visit my company headquarters, spend a few days seeing how we operate, meet people who can show you things that don't get taught in classrooms." Jayden blinked. "Your company?" The man nodded. "Holt Aeronautics. We design and build the kind of aircraft you are on today. Your father and I started the early version of it decades ago." His gaze held steady. "You've got a future ahead of you, and I think I can help shape it if you're willing." It was the first time since they'd met that Jayden felt completely off balance. The day had already been a collision of events he hadn't expected. And now, this invitation that sounded less like a favor and more like a door being opened to an entirely different life. "I don't know much about any of that," Jayden admitted after a pause. "You'll learn," the man said simply. "That's the point. I don't expect you to walk in knowing everything. I expect you to walk in ready to listen, ready to ask the right questions. Your father had that quality. I think you do too." Jayden hesitated. His instinct was to guard himself, to keep from assuming too much about someone he'd just met. But the way the man spoke, measured, direct, without embellishment, made it feel less like a sales pitch and more like a challenge. "What exactly would I be doing there?" Jayden asked. "Observing to start," the man said. "You'd see how projects move from concept to completion. You'd sit in on meetings, talk to engineers, analysts, executives. I'd introduce you to people who could teach you more in a week than some do in a semester." Jayden looked down at the envelope in his hand. The airline's apology was tangible, but this was something else entirely. An opportunity that hadn't existed that morning, one that felt like it could change the direction of things if he let it. He looked back up, meeting the man's gaze. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll come." A faint nod from the man was the only acknowledgement, but it felt final, like a decision had been made on both sides. Then, without another word, they started walking again, blending back into the steady current of travelers, the noise of the terminal swallowing the moment whole. The rain had stopped just before Jayden arrived at the Glass and Steel headquarters. Leaving the pavement outside gleaming under a thin wash of sunlight, the building rose above the surrounding block like a statement, sleek lines, reflective panels, and the company's name etched in bold lettering near the entrance. Standing at the base of it, Jayden felt a momentary pause, the quiet weight of realizing he was here, walking into a place he'd only heard of in passing weeks before. The lobby was vast but uncluttered, with high ceilings and lights streaming down through skylights that made the polished floor shine. Receptionists greeted him with the same efficient warmth given to guests who mattered, offering him a visitor badge before directing him toward a waiting elevator. The man was already there when the doors opened, standing with his hands clasped. Lightly in front of him, his presence as steady as it had been in the airport. "Ready to see what your father helped build?" he asked. Jayden nodded, stepping inside. The elevator moved with barely a sound, carrying them up through the building's core. When the doors opened again, they stepped into a floor alive with motion. Designers bent over monitors displaying intricate 3D renderings of aircraft interiors. Engineers moved between workstations, their conversations low but focused. The air had a hum to it, not noise exactly, but a sense of energy threaded through every movement. They began in the design wing, where a department head introduced herself, and walked Jayden through the early stages of concept development. On one screen, the curve of a wing was being adjusted millimeter by millimeter. On another, color palettes for interior seating were being compared under different lighting simulations. It was precise work, but there was an artistry in it too. A balance of creativity and technical mastery that Jayden hadn't expected. From there, they toured the testing facilities. Massive chambers lined with sensors surrounded a full-scale fuselage, where engineers ran environmental simulations, extreme temperatures, rapid pressure changes, vibration tests. Jayden watched as the team monitored screens filled with shifting graphs and numbers, their eyes locked on the smallest fluctuations. One of them explained how each line of data told a story about the aircraft's durability, safety, and performance under strain. In another section, it passed through a manufacturing floor where robotic arms moved in perfect synchronization, welding and fastening components with a precision no human hand could match. The noise was louder here, punctuated by the hiss of air tools and the rhythmic clank of machinery. Jayden stood still for a moment, watching as a fuselage section was lowered into place, its scale dwarfing the people guiding it into position. At every stop, the man introduced him not as a casual visitor, but as someone with a personal connection to the company's roots. Department heads shook his hand, explained their work, and spoke of challenges as if they were inviting him into the problem-solving process. Jayden asked questions, hesitant at first. Then with growing confidence, each answer layered another detail onto his understanding of what this place was and what it could mean. By the time they reached the executive floor, the view from the tall windows stretched for miles. The city spread out below like a detailed map. The man gestured toward the skyline. "Your father stood here once back when all this was still an idea," he said. "He believed in what we were building and in the people who could carry it forward. I see that same potential in you." Jayden didn't answer right away. He turned back toward the floor below, where the steady rhythm of creation continued in every department. For the first time, he could picture himself here not just as an observer, but as someone with a role to play. The thought was both daunting and exhilarating. When they left the building that afternoon, the sun had fully broken through the clouds, lighting the glass facade in a way that made it look almost weightless. Jayden glanced back once before getting into the car, the image fixed in his mind. It didn't feel like the end of a visit. It felt like the first step through a door that had only just opened. The airport was busy, the ebb and flow of travelers moving in practice streams toward their gates. Jayden walked through it with his carry-on rolling smoothly behind him, his boarding pass tucked neatly in his pocket. The voices over the PA announced boarding calls for other flights, each one blending into the background hum of movement and anticipation. He wasn't rushing, and he wasn't second-guessing each step toward the gate. This time, he knew exactly where he belonged. The gate came into view, its counter staffed by attendants scanning tickets and greeting passengers with polite efficiency. A line was already forming for first-class boarding, and Jayden joined it without hesitation. There was no flicker of doubt in his mind about whether his place there would be questioned. The ticket in his pocket wasn't just a pass to a seat, it was a quiet affirmation of how far things had shifted since the last time he had stood in this spot. When he reached the front, the gate attendant smiled faintly and scanned his pass. The soft beep was almost insignificant in sound, but it felt solid in meaning. She handed it back without pause, her gesture smooth, unremarkable the way it should have been all along. Jayden offered a polite nod and stepped forward, the narrow curve of the jet bridge ahead of him. The hum of the air conditioning and the muted echo of footsteps accompanied him as he walked down the bridge. The moment didn't carry the weight it once had. There was no tightening in his chest, no lingering fear that someone would stop him. The aircraft door came into view, the silver frame bright under the cabin lights. A flight attendant at the entrance greeted him warmly and directed him to his seat. The aisle was quiet, a few passengers already settled, with their bags tucked away and drinks in hand. Jayden moved toward the front, stopping at the wide leather seat by the window. His carry-on slid into the overhead bin with a smooth push, and he lowered himself into the seat, fastening the belt across his lap. Outside the window, the wings stretched toward the runway, the sunlight catching along its edge. Beyond it, service trucks moved in slow, deliberate patterns, fueling, loading, and preparing the plane for departure. Jayden rested his elbow lightly against the armrest and leaned toward the glass, letting the view fill his focus. It wasn't that he had forgotten what happened before. The memory of being stopped, questioned, and escorted off still existed, but it no longer sat like a shadow over moments like this. Instead, it felt like a marker, one point in time, against which he could measure everything that came after. He thought of the man who had intervened, of the offer he had made, of the weeks spent walking through the company's headquarters and meeting people who treated him as someone with a future worth investing in. Those experiences were now woven into how he saw himself, reshaping the narrative that had once threatened to define him. The boarding process continued, the sound of overhead bins opening and closing, punctuating the steady murmur of voices. Jayden kept his gaze on the tarmac, watching as the ground crew finished their work and stepped back. He felt the faint thud of the cabin door closing, followed by the chime of the intercom. The flight attendants moved through their final checks, the captain's voice coming over the speakers with a calm announcement of their route and expected arrival time. As the plane began to push back from the gate, Jayden sat a little straighter, his hand resting loosely on his knee. The slow taxi to the runway brought with it the familiar vibration underfoot, a reminder of the moment that was coming. The engines roared to life, and the acceleration pressed him gently into his seat. He kept his eyes forward, the runway lights flashing past in quick succession. The ground fell away, the horizon tilting as the plane lifted into open air. The city below shrank into a patchwork of streets and rooftops, the sunlight glinting off glass and water. Jayden watched until the view gave way to a sea of clouds, the white expanse stretching endlessly in every direction. He let out a slow breath, one that carried the weight of the past with it, but not its hold. This moment wasn't about what had been taken from him before, it was about what he had reclaimed. And what he had built in the space that followed, whatever lay ahead, it would be. Shaped by what he chose to carry forward, and by what he was willing to leave behind.